asking those questions. And I'm going to moderate, so I'll just pick them up and we'll go from there. And that's not to say if you've put your hand up and you don't have a chat, we'll get to you as well for as much time as we have. So is everybody kind of familiar with the Zoom? Are you okay with the buttons? Anyone flummoxed, as they say? All right, well, we'll go ahead. If you do have any problems, let us know. Yeah, Jim has replied to, for those of you who may not have chat up, which says, will this, Jocelyn had asked, will this session be recorded? And yes, we are going to record this session. Sam, you put your hand up. Did you have a question? Or are you just playing with the buttons? Okay, that's good. That's good. Now, what we're going to do it's just easier because some people forget that they're not on mute, and then there's all kinds of noises that start happening. Jim Lean's our administrator, and he's going to put everybody on mute with the exception of Elizabeth while she's speaking. So with that, I'm certainly pleased to welcome Elizabeth as our speaker this evening. And I think all of you know Elizabeth from her work and attendance at Runnymede. And our affirming committee is really quite fortunate to have her as a member. She's just great to have her contribution. But I don't know how much you know about her personally. So just as a little bit of background, Elizabeth has been an active member at Runnymede since 2011. She sings in the RUC choir, presents in the annual pageant, is on the affirming committee, and was a member of the minister search committee. When Elizabeth is not spending time with her Runnymede family, she loves to write, run, swim, trampoline, and do triathlons. I'm exhausted already. That's amazing. She's a strong advocate in the disability community, having been on CBC's White Coat Black Art to discuss the impact of COVID on the disability community. By the way, I listened in on that and it was remarkable. Elizabeth is just an amazing pro when she's presenting on any kind of media. In the fall of 2020, that's this fall, if my numbers are still correct, Elizabeth will be starting her PhD at Western University, exploring the impact directed funded services have on community engagement for adults with physical disabilities. So at that point, I'm just going to hand it over to Elizabeth, and welcome.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I have to say, I'd hoped to do this in a circle in the big memorial hall with coffee and maybe some of that delicious cheese and baking that we had at our last February affirming meeting, but alas, we're in a new world. So welcome. So my name is Elizabeth Mohler, and I'd like to share a bit about my journey finding inclusive ministry in all its various dimensions. So to start, I thought it would be good to explore what an inclusive ministry actually means. And Eric Carter, in his book titled Faith and Disability, tells us that an inclusive ministry is one which enables, empowers, engages all persons within the worship community, regardless of ability. So this stems from a belief that God has created us all equally as valued people in his image. An inclusive ministry is not just a program. It is not about creating a special class or a separate ministry, or even identifying, quote unquote, the disabled as objects of ministry. But instead, it may be summarized in the motto, ministry by and with people with disabilities, in contrast to ministry for people with disabilities. It is about opening the doors of the church to include those with disabilities to fully participate in the life and work of the church. So that's kind of what Eric Carter has to say about ministry. And here I'll just kind of take a little bit of a step back and just kind of talk about, you know, my early years in the church and sort of my years growing up in the church before I found Runnymede. So when I was very young, probably about, I'm going to say age 3, I went with my family to a church in the neighborhood. And that family consisted of myself, my two brothers who live with autism and are nonverbal, and my mom and my dad, and my other brother, Kyle, who does not have a disability. And so we went into the church, and like families with kids, small kids, we were a little late because sometimes that happens on Sunday. Just when you're ready to get out the door, somebody spills something on their shirt or somebody can't find their shoes. So we were a little late, but we went and we sat down at the front and started to engage in the service in different ways depending on our abilities. And the minister presiding over the service, because we were loud, rambunctious children, and a couple of us in the family who were nonverbal were maybe a bit louder and a bit more rambunctious, we were asked to leave. So at that point, we got up and we left. And that was sort of one of my formative memories of church, but it gets better. That was definitely a very sort of challenging, pun intended, eye-opening experience for me. Even young, I can remember that, and I've talked about it with my family since when I've been reflecting on inclusive ministry. Kind of what that was like. And I mean, I think we can agree that, you know, certainly there's lots of noise on a Sunday service when there's little kids, but at that particular worship community, we weren't welcomed. Our family did find a worship community here in Toronto, in this neighborhood, where we worshiped together for several years, and I was included in everything from the youth group to Sunday school. I volunteered. And then when I went away to university, I found a wonderful United Church and sang in the choir there. And then when I came back, I found my way to Runnymede. So that's a very brief snapshot just of my journey, and really just to say that it didn't start necessarily inclusive, but it has become that in a way. So for, you know, all of us want to find a place to belong, to grow in faith, and to form meaningful relationships. We all long to be part of a community that brings meaning and purpose and opportunity. And we want to be able to contribute as well as receive. And I'll talk about that in a moment, because the contributing piece is really important. I'll note here the importance of contribution for all of us, regardless of disability. Contribution is really important, and sometimes depending on the experience of others in the church with individuals who have a disability, it can be difficult to imagine ways in which people with disabilities, especially very severe disabilities, could contribute in a meaningful and practical way. In my experience, the key to finding ways to contribute is to get creative and to get flexible. And I'll use some examples from my own family, and of course with permission from my family. My parents and brother Colin attend Windermere United Church, which is one of our neighborhood churches here in the West End. And Colin is nonverbal, and he is also legally blind. And he attends church once a month, well, now every week on Zoom, but prior to that, once a month when he is home with us in the community, when he's not at his home at Camp Hill. So when he attends Windermere, he is able to assist in a number of ways. He contributes by greeting at the beginning of the service with the support of either one of my parents or another congregant. He takes up collection, and he has also helped to serve communion. And the key here is that in this situation, people kind of thought outside the box, and they looked at how to include Colin in a way that was both meaningful and allowed him to experience the life and work of the church. I'll illustrate another example from my own life, going to the church and thinking about ways to be creative. So as many of you know, I sing in the Runnymede United Choir, and I wanted to be able to participate, and a big part of that is being able to read the music, or at least have the lyrics to the music so I could participate. So with a little ingenuity, thanks to some friends in the choir who I won't embarrass, we were able to find a system where the music for each piece that we would sing on a Sunday morning was typed up and then emailed to me. And when I first joined the choir, it was just about reaching out and finding some transcription volunteers who might be able to help turn that music into lyrics I could put on my Braille display. And that's not an easy task when you're singing a Latin requiem, let me tell you. So we were able to secure a couple of volunteers, and that's been working really well ever since. And it's again about finding ways for me to have a voice on a Sunday morning, and that meant the difference between doing that and not. So again, sometimes we just have to stretch our way of thinking and imagine a new way of quote unquote doing things. So one of the potential challenges with churches is the wide range of disabilities and abilities. So everything from physical, cognitive to mental health. A ministry approach that is principally based in universal design and inclusion is much more effective than a program-oriented one. So principles of inclusive ministry are not necessarily restricted to a Sunday school class, like I said before, a specialized program, but they are formative in all functioning of ministries of the church. And I just want to pause and say universal design. I won't bore you with that lecture tonight, but it's really looking at incorporating all different types of learning styles and learning needs into worship. That's basically what universal design is. It's just thinking about everyone's unique needs. So we do not want to necessarily create, like I said, a specialized program that deals with or for people with disabilities. We want people with disabilities to come alongside in faith and feel loved and valued by God. The aforementioned points aside, there are several barriers that all of us, I think, would agree that we can see in terms of including everyone, and certainly people with disabilities. And these might range from physical and architectural barriers to how to engage with somebody with a disability in worship. So before I go into barriers, I just wanted to pause because that's a whole lot of information I threw at you, and I promise there's no test at the end. Is there any questions?
Anyone have any question at this point at all? We can keep going, and if you think of something, start putting them into the chat room, and we can answer them as we go.
Okay, so it looks like so far no questions. So I'll just start in with our first barrier here. So our first barrier, I labeled it myths and misconceptions, but I think I would say attitudes. So certainly attitudes can form myths and misconceptions. So myths and misconceptions. So a significant barrier to building inclusive ministries is misunderstandings and misconceptions regarding disability. So outdated notions, fears, misinformation, and the discomfort that congregants may feel might prevent people with disabilities from being meaningfully and holistically engaged in the life of the local church. So I'll just unpack that a bit. So I think we all feel at times discomfort or uncomfortable, especially when we don't know what to say or what to do. And it can be really challenging too if you're in a situation where perhaps somebody's disability is one where there might be outbursts, or there might be periods where they're upset. So that's understandable. We all have kind of misconceptions or experience discomfort at times. But I think the great thing about this is we start to recognize that and start to understand that that's, you know, part of human nature, but at least start to kind of have those conversations. So this is compounded by the fact that each disability presents itself differently and has unique challenges and strategies. So for example, some disabilities are physical, others are cognitive, and others may be a combination of both physical and cognitive disabilities. So how a person might appear or sound or act may, quote, put off, quote, people or cause them to remain at a bit of a distance. And I think we've all been there. So close relationships and friendships are one of the greatest needs of many people with disabilities, and indeed many people without disabilities. And it's important for all of us, absolutely, to thrive. But yet people who don't have disabilities don't often face the same number of obstacles in establishing or maintaining these relationships as those with disabilities might. I think one of the keys I've learned to overcoming misconceptions and myths and the establishment of strong relationships is sometimes just to ask. So I know oftentimes people will say, I'm just not sure how to approach you, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I'm worried I will offend you. And the reality is, yes, at times you might say the wrong thing, although I'm a pretty open book. But I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is we all sometimes say the wrong thing, regardless of whether we're dealing with disability or not. And so what I would say is, you might, and that's okay. And at that time, I might take the opportunity um, to listen, and the opportunity to explain how you might have said whatever it is differently, and perhaps the importance of words and language. So what I might mean by that is sometimes a very common phrase when talking about the disability community is the disabled, but that kind of others us. And so I might explain that myself. I prefer to be called a person with a disability, a person first. And I would explain why that is. So I think the thing about myths and misconceptions is we all have them, but at the end of the day, taking that time to approach someone, even if they are, as Judith said at the beginning of the talk, not like us or an other. Does anyone have any questions or comments or things they want to throw out at this point in the chat?
Yeah, we have one question here, Elizabeth.
Excellent.
The question is, have you experienced any barriers specifically at Runnymede?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you to whoever raised that. I was going to preface before I started barriers that these are a combination of barriers that Dr. Eric Carter writes about, and also my own personal barriers. So, when I'm going through these, I certainly don't want anyone feeling like, oh God, did we do that? Because it's also not a bad thing if we do. It's a learning point. But also to say that some of these are written by Dr. Carter. So barriers at Runnymede, yes, I can say that certainly in my early days, back in 2011, there were barriers to information. A print order of service was given to me, and it doesn't matter how big you make the print, I still won't be able to read it. We used to have, and I don't know if we still do, this phone directory where there'd be a photo of a person and a little blurby and their name and phone number, and that was not accessible to me. So it was a lot of things around information. But what I would say is kind of twofold. One being, as our technology at Runnymede has really improved for everybody, it's also made my world easier. So a shout out to the people in the office that send out the order of service on a Friday to, I think, anybody that wants it. I know lots of people I've talked to have gotten it, with the hymn numbers and what we're doing on a Sunday. I know our services are recorded or have been in the past, so that's been wonderful. Again, not just for me, but for anybody that misses a service. And I think, speaking a little broader than just Runnymede, one of the really wonderful things that the United Church of Canada has done is put their hymn books online. So if you want to look up a hymn at home, you don't have to go to the church and get the big red book and bring it home. You can actually go online and download the More Voices and the Voices United hymn book. So those technology pieces have really made it so that barriers that I faced in my earlier days at Runnymede are not as present. That's a great question. Great, so I think I'll move on to the second barrier. And this was one out of Dr. Carter's book, and also a woman at Church House, Kim Umbach, who does work around inclusive ministry, wrote about this as well. So this isn't something necessarily that I would say Runnymede is maybe experiencing, but I think it's good to talk about, and that is age-appropriate ministry. So another barrier, especially with people who may experience cognitive disabilities, is that often we may stigmatize them as sort of perpetual children, and therefore the teaching materials and approaches can sometimes be patronizing or not age appropriate. So we must remember that regardless of the severity of someone's disability, people have the right and the need to be responded to and treated according to who they are, not who we perceive them to be. So I'll just kind of unpack that for a moment. So for example, my brother, Colin, who's nonverbal, he's still a 40-year-old guy wanting to experience the world as a 40-year-old guy does. And so I think about this in terms of, it can be tempting sometimes, I think, to maybe talk down to a bit. So it means that we ensure that our tone, like I was saying, isn't condescending, and also to be mindful of voice and phrases and words that may be tended to be used towards small children. I've seen people, certainly not a Runnymede, talk to me like that sometimes, and it can be a little bit frustrating, but we're all here to learn. It means that we seek to include persons with disabilities in conversations and welcome their experiences, as we've done through this Affirming Committee, as explorations of the full body of Christ. So while pictures and songs and activities are needed and certainly may be appropriate, we simply need to make sure that they honor and are respectful of the person's age and communication ability. So setting people up as perpetual children is another way that kind of says, we have little or nothing to learn from you. And in doing so, we may close ourselves off to the ways in which God looks to teach us about different types of people and the love that they can offer. So again, not to say that that's necessarily something I've personally seen at Runnymede, but I wanted to include it as Dr. Carter writes about it in his seminal work. This barrier, I think, is the most political, and it is the cost of access, the physical cost of access. So one of the reasons that churches might resist establishing quote-unquote inclusive ministries is the fear of what it might cost. And let's be honest, churches are often housed in old buildings with lots of stairs and narrow doorways. Unless you're lucky enough to be in one of those fancy downtown churches, even if you have an elevator, it probably doesn't go everywhere in the church. So let's face it, churches are largely housed in older buildings where putting in an elevator can be costly and can be difficult in terms of creating space. Even accessible washroom space can be at a premium. So while there may be costs associated with making a physical building accessible to somebody, you can also look to the AODA, so Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act legislation, to look at ways that things can be done at low or no cost. And there are actually funding grants and funding programs that can help buildings that are wanting to restore become accessible. And I didn't know this. So you can apply for those grants, and I can give information later on the specifics of where to apply for. They're called accessibility grants, and they're really cool because let's face it, it's not cheap to put in an elevator. So any kind of funding can help for sure. One of the ways too that you can check kind of to see where you're at in terms of your accessibility of the building, and I don't just mean an elevator, I mean the stairs, the washrooms, the handrails. Let's face it, we're all getting older. Those steps at the front of the church are pretty steep. Making sure that there's a steady handrail there is by doing an accessibility audit. And there are companies that do that, and you can either do that through a company and pay a fee, or you can download a toolkit online and do it free of charge should you wish. The great thing about these audits, it's not like an exam where people come in and they say, oh, here's all the things you're doing wrong. It's a really great opportunity. I've been part of accessibility audits to see, here's where we're at. It gives you an understanding of here's where we're at in terms of physical accessibility and our building and our community's accessibility, and here are the steps we want to take to get that little bit better in terms of making our space more accessible and welcoming. So it's a really great process. There may be actually costs associated, but like I said, there are grants that can help with that. And there may be things that you can do that are free or no cost options to accessibility. So here are two great examples. I'm going to share with you about some things that can be done that are free and actually help everybody. So not related to the building, but related to accessible ministry is providing the order of service online. It means not only that if someone doesn't show up on a Sunday, they can say, oh, okay, I see that that group I'm a part of met last week. I better follow up and see what I missed. Or, oh, I'd actually like to go on Sunday. I see in the order of service that group is meeting. But it means that people with visual disabilities who can't access a small print paper bulletin can access the order of service. So it's this really beautiful synergy between an accessibility accommodation and just, hey, this is so great for everybody who wants to know what's going on in the church, and keeping everyone up to date. Another really great kind of low cost option, and I think it's brilliant, is putting bright tape at the edges of steps. And the reason this is good is especially in the winter for people to see where one step ends and the next one begins. I like the bright tape, especially because some of the stairwells can be kind of dark. And again, I think it helps everybody. So I think the other thing, I really struggle with this one, because part of our church space is accessible and part of it isn't. But there's also so many beautiful things that go on outside the church, whether it's a book study in someone's home, or whether it's a wonderful opportunity to do an Alpha course. And how do we make sure that you know, that's inclusive? Lots of houses, including my own, are not accessible. And so I would pause there to see if there's any questions, because again, I think I've thrown a lot at you.
Yeah, actually, there's a couple questions that have come forward, and I think Elizabeth, you probably touched on some, but let me combine them.
Sure.
I guess the question really is, one was, what things could RUC do better with respect to some of the accessibility issues you've talked about? And the other one, quite similar in nature, is what can we do to improve not only the accessibility, but our ability to be more inclusive? So I guess it's, which of these things would you say, if there was one thing you would do at RUC that would improve accessibility for people with disabilities, what would it be?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky one. I think I'm going to say that using technology, as we've all learned through this pandemic, can be a really beautiful way to bring people into the fold. So if, for example, you are running a group at your home, and I'm talking a church group, I'm not saying a bunch of friends for dinner, I mean, say you're running a book study or Bible study. Maybe if you are comfortable putting on the invitation, home has, and this is something I've started to do in my own work, you know, my home unfortunately has several steps. So individuals requiring, you know, a flat entrance, or who use a wheelchair or have a stroller, might find this difficult, but I've actually started to include a Zoom link. So if I'm doing something at my house, of course now no one's doing anything at their house, but if I'm having a gathering, having an option for people to Zoom in remotely and at least be there virtually with us. The other thing I would say that we could do is, I wonder if there's a way, I know I've been up on that top floor for many committee meetings, and I got to tell you, even as someone that can do the stairs, it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And so I wonder about trying to either find ways to book Memorial Hall or the sanctuary for committee meetings and meetings where folks at the church gather where possible. I mean, our sanctuary is so beautiful. Or again, offering that remote option. So, hey, the women's committee is meeting next Monday night in the West Room. I don't even know if we have a West Room. I think we do. A West Room, in the West Room. And I'd like to just let you guys know that there's a Zoom link available. I want to say that this isn't just about people with disabilities. It means that people with responsibilities who couldn't maybe physically come to the church can be present, or people that don't live in the neighborhood that want to be present, that go to our church. So again, I think two things: bringing in technology where it's appropriate, and really trying to have meetings where we can. And I know every space is at a premium, in spaces that are accessible. And unfortunately in our church, it's the sanctuary and Memorial Hall. But that would be what I would say, and I hope that that's helpful. Was there another question there, Judy?
Well, I actually combined two.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think one other is, you know, you are such a major part of the church, but are you aware, or have you felt that we are inadvertently, and I say inadvertently, less welcoming of people with disabilities than perhaps we could be? And I'm talking really now just attitude and maybe tripping over our own 2 feet at times. I know I feel awkward sometimes if I'm trying to welcome someone. What's been your, and are you attuned to that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think sometimes it's really hard. Welcoming is so hard because you don't want to over welcome people and they go, wow, those people are way too enthusiastic. I'm not going back there. But I think one thing that I would say, and I'm not saying we're not doing it, but I would just say, as you know, thinking about leadership at all its levels and how that beautiful array of diversity, not just disability, but all diversity, is reflected in our church's leadership. So whether it's committees, boards, volunteers. So I would just say, you know, moving forward, to really continue as a committee, certainly us as the Affirming Committee, but also just as a leadership team on the board, to think about, okay, you know, what kind of, how do we make sure that all the voices that we can include are included? And I also preface that by saying that you don't want to have sort of tokenism either. You don't want to be the disabled person on the board. But just thinking about diversity and leadership, I think, is where I would leave that. And it's certainly a very, it can be a very complex discussion for sure.
For sure.
Great. So maybe I'll just move on to our next barrier. This is our 4th one, and this one's kind of cool because well, it's not cool, but it's one I never thought of until Dr. Carter, Eric Carter, wrote about it. But it really reminds me of my own family. So it's about how responses and the way we declare the gospel. So we often are very linear, and I'm not just saying we at Runnymede. I think a lot of churches are very linear in their approach to the gospel. So receiving the good news is often viewed as a verbal and intellectual assent to certain doctrines or beliefs. However, those with cognitive or speech disabilities may have difficulty in understanding the gospel in this form, and people with physical disabilities may not be able to communicate it in the same way that perhaps you and I can. So we need to kind of discover other ways or other modes of declaring the gospel and what it means to respond to the gospel. So it may mean that we need to explore how to preach the tactile gospel. I think that'd be kind of cool. One that explores the gospel through an array of senses, whether that's touch and sight and sound. In addition, we need to ask the question, what is the person learning about through the grace and mercy and gentleness of God? And I think I would say, again, one of the really cool things that I've thought about since thinking about ways we preach the gospel is my own family's journey at Windermere. And my brother, Colin, whom I mentioned earlier in this presentation, is becoming a member. So Colin probably isn't going to sit down and write you an essay on, you know, what it means to be a member of Windermere United and get up and give a presentation. That's not going to work for him. So he's been doing some Skype meetings one-on-one with the minister at Windermere, and he's been attending Zoom church with his housemates at Camp Hill Communities, Ontario. And as well, he's been participating in the way he can in the church. So I think it's really about just thinking about how we communicate the gospel and how we accept those who might come to that gospel a little bit differently than perhaps you or I might do. So I kind of titled the next section From Barriers to Belonging because I don't want to end on doom and gloom like all these barriers. So we've discussed just a snapshot of some of the barriers, and I tried to pick different barriers that are experienced by people with disabilities in the church. And you may have noticed, one thing I did want to say is you may have noticed I used disabled people and people with disabilities interchangeably, and I did that quite deliberately because language is really important, and I won't bore you on the whole discourse of disability talk tonight. But what I will say is it's quite a fraught topic, and I would say that people like to be, it's very personal. So some people may want to be called a person with a disability using person first language, and others maybe want to be called a disabled person because the environment disables that person. So what do I mean by that? If you give me a print handout, I can't read that, and it's the inaccessibility of the print handout that is disabling, not necessarily me, or it's how those two things interact. So I think that comment leads really nicely into my point around, if you aren't sure how to help or what to do, ask. And I actually give another talk called The Power of the Ask. And often people can give insight into what their own needs are. So just if you kind of listen and watch and ask, and there's a really great motto that I find really helpful that I think would apply here around including building inclusive ministry, and that is nothing about me without me. So always doing that ask. So it simply means the person with the disability is included in the circle of discussion around how to make spaces more inclusive, like we're doing tonight. And this will help keep the church person-centered in the planning as it seeks to grow in ministry around inclusion and disability. And then challenges are I think sometimes ones that we don't know until we have these conversations. I also wanted to say too that I haven't touched a lot on Sunday school, and I think I want to say too that when working with children who may identify as having a disability in the Sunday school, parents are a really awesome resource, as is the child, around what strategies might work best. So would they need a quiet room at some point during Sunday school? Do we need to make sure that field trips are accessible? Do we need to maybe make sure that that child has a buddy? And I will kind of go back to my own experience and say that during my upbringing in the church, I attended Sunday school and youth group and went on trips just like my peers. And we established for me that the system of having a peer or buddy just to kind of team up with worked really well. And that person is now one of my closest friends. We've stayed in touch for over 30 years now. So sometimes these kinds of things that seem like accommodations can build really beautiful synergies and really beautiful connections that last. And I'm personally really excited to be on this journey of growth and learning and affirming together. I know myself, I have more questions right now than answers, but taking the time to ask those difficult questions, feel that bit of uncomfortableness or that bit of discomfort, and question my own assumptions will help me engage in conversations and be that great first step to becoming a more inclusive ministry. So at this point, I'd like to open back up for questions. And I want to say that there's no bad questions, there's no silly questions, there's no, so please feel free to ask.
That's great, Elizabeth. Well, here's one that I think is very on point when you were talking about asking people and talking to them. And it's, I think it's a very interesting point. It's certainly been on my mind as well. And that is, we don't always develop our interpersonal relationships by Zoom or through technology, but rather in kind of face-to-face reactions and relationships. So if we don't always know that someone may have a disability. It could be something that is just not obvious to us. So the question here is, should we wait for them to self-identify? And sometimes we might be believing that there's something we need to respond to be able to change our interaction, but we simply aren't certain and we don't know how to be inclusive. So it'd be very interesting to have you address that.
Yeah, for sure. I think I would say you're right. It's difficult to know. You certainly don't want to go for someone who says, so I always think about messaging, and I think about, you know, maybe when as a community we're putting out messages around we're having a really wonderful gala dinner next week, maybe a simple message like, if you require it, there's an elevator down to the hall. If you require assistance, here's a contact that please feel free to get in touch with. You know, I know that we're needing certainly to think about fundraising. We are a church after all, but maybe even offering a support person ticket for folks that need it, or, you know, thinking about a discounted support person ticket. Those are cool, really kind of things you can put into the messaging that isn't sort of having to call out people, but rather sort of, I guess, call them in.
That's very interesting. And we have another question here too, and it's how would RUC prepare for someone who with a disability who wants to be a member? What should we be doing in advance of someone new arriving? Is there any such thing as a program, or is it we leave it up to individuals, or what's your advice?
I mean, I think for myself, it's such a hard one because everyone's so different. I think that big question of, what can we do? What do you need? Is there something that we can do to support you? Would be really helpful. I know in a lot of churches there's quite a bit of reading that's involved and discussions in small groups. It just depends on the church and what the process is for becoming a member. So I think just that simple, what do you need? It's really great. We're happy that you're thinking about becoming a member of our Runnymede family. What can we do? And hopefully from there, the person will be able to give a little bit of guidance around what it is they need. And sometimes you might figure it out together. I know when I took, which was a wonderful experience, the Alpha course a few years ago, I kind of didn't know what to expect with Alpha. I thought, is there homework, is there essays, and is there a test at the end? One of the things that worked really well for me was buddying up with somebody during the video time when there was the video shown, just to kind of give me any context I might be missing visually. So whether there was text on the screen or whether there was perhaps images I couldn't see going on that were really critical to the movie story. So those are the kind of, sometimes you got to figure it out together as well.
Okay, excellent. So with my mind towards the timing, it's about 7:45 right now. If I can ask anyone who would like to simply ask a question directly to unmute, we can certainly do that. We'll give it a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone at all? Roy, did you want to? Go ahead, Roy. Can you hear it? Yep.
Am I on? Yes.
You are, Roy.
Yes, we can hear you. Yep, perfect.
This presentation is served to remind us all of the importance of being aware and sensitive to what other people are presenting that we may not be aware of. But I'm reminded of the fact that when the Ontario disability or accessibility legislation was introduced a number of years ago, there were training programs, there was material galore that was produced. Many people from Runnymede attended the courses. We did some in-house training. We've got policies galore that were approved by the board. And I guess it seems that probably over time, other things come along and we forget what we've undertaken in the past. I'm just wondering, how do we build in ongoing programs or training to make sure that we continue to be sensitive? Elizabeth has given us a number of ideas of how things have improved, but there's obviously much more that can be done. And that's my question, is just how do we make it part of our routine to welcome people and make sure that we're being attentive to their circumstances.
Roy, I think that's an excellent point. And one of the things that the committee is looking at is, assuming we go forward, well, when we go forward, we have to actually have an ongoing education plan. So to become an affirming ministry, while we're going through education and discernment, there needs to be an ongoing plan for how we keep going with our education. And you've raised an excellent point. I mean, I remember when AODA was launched, and there is a lot of good support material, and I'm sure they will have refreshed it. So one of the things that we are doing in a full array of areas, the Affirming Ministry Committee is actually looking at what resources are already, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's so much out there. And so our job now is to try to put it into maybe a cohesive package that people can access at their leisure, or, you know, in their interest. So excellent for bringing that up. That's very, very helpful. Does anyone else have any questions? Derek.
Okay, there we go. So Elizabeth, you described a lot of things that we can do sort of institutionally, you know, in terms of barriers and obstacles and so on. And, you know, how do you get sort of the people on the ground, you know, to sort of change their attitude and thinking towards people with disabilities? I mean, I guess this is part of the journey, raising awareness, but what kinds of things could we do for the individual people. There you go.
Yeah, I think one of the steps is this process, what we're doing here tonight, affirming and having these presentations of all different diversity groups. But I think another thing is, I think the more present people are, so when people come to the church, they feel welcome, they come back, and we see different people with different types of disabilities and abilities. I think we become more aware, and then that helps us sort of shift our attitude. And I think, again, I'll go back to sort of a point I made earlier about when people are involved, they're not just kind of passively, unless that's what they choose to do. Some people do want to come to church and just sit and enjoy the worship and the music. And but I think when people get involved at all levels, and you can kind of see what the capabilities are of different people, it's a really beautiful thing. So I'll use my own self for an example, and I know this comment was not meant to be rude, so I don't take it as such, but I was married a few years ago in the pageant, and that required a lot of reading, so I had my braille display, and somebody after, and not a mean way, said, "Oh, I actually didn't know how you could read." And so I explained what that was, what that device was. So I think seeing people in action is certainly one way to change perceptions, for sure. It was a big learning moment for me that day, for sure.
Interesting.
Hi, Judy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, Judy. I'm the proud mother of Elizabeth. Anyway, just a couple of comments. Because Windermere United Church, which is our home church, has gone through their affirming ministry journey. But one of the things I will tell you, I mean, I think looking at LGBTQ plus is important. Mental health is very, very important. Racism, ageism, and youth. And I think our journey, we didn't focus enough time or have enough time to really delve into making sure that we had youth presenting to us as an affirming ministry, and probably more time on ageism. We kind of front loaded it with LGBTQ, but there's so many different aspects, including racism. So I just say, that was just my comment from going through the journey, that there were other priorities that we either needed to take more time on or include into our journey. So very proud of my daughter.
That's that, and we are delighted to have her, believe me. Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was really helpful. You've hit on a very important point, in fact, with the unrest that we've seen really throughout the world right now on the topic of racism and Black Lives Matter. We are arranging a speaker to talk on our next Zoom call will actually be on racism. We're still finalizing that from the committee. We're hoping to do that, I believe, in, Martha, you might know better than me, whether it's July or I think it's August, is it not?
Yeah, we're looking over the summer. We were going to do that in the fall, but I think because of the whole unrest and just the events that have happened, that we think that it would be better to do it sooner rather than later. But we're trying to find speakers, and it's a little bit difficult with holidays and whatnot.
Yeah. And also with the number of people that are available. So we will in September. We have a speaker, an Indigenous man who is also gay, who has been he does quite a bit of work on reconciliation, and is a remarkable speaker. And he has agreed to do a Zoom call for us as well in September. So we want to bring more of these. Time is going quickly, and we know. These are tough times when everything's by Zoom, so we are conscious of that as well. Are there any more questions for Elizabeth? Elizabeth, you want to say any kind of final words?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I just want to thank the Affirming Committee and Judy and Paul, who's not here tonight. I think just for this opportunity to come and share my journey and my story. I did this at Windermere about 1.5 years ago. It was a really special experience. And it was a really special experience tonight, really different doing it in a virtual world. But I think that this is really, as I said in my talk, really exciting, because I think we're getting to know all the great things we're doing and all the ways we can grow. So it's not about what's right or wrong. It's here's all the awesome stuff at Runnymede and here's how we can grow. And I think growth is really exciting. So I'll leave it with that, and just to say that I'm easily found on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook if you do want to connect with me, or of course through the church they can connect you to me. So thank you so much everyone for coming, and God bless, and please stay safe, and I hope your family is healthy and safe as well.
Yeah. And a huge thanks to Elizabeth for taking the time and speaking with us. We really appreciate it. Again, we'll get back to you on our next session, and we're going to start to see resource materials on the website. So thank you all very much. If you have any questions or any suggestions, email us, contact us in any way. Any one of the members of the committee is more than open, as well as board members have been just marvelous about their openness to helping us along the way. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, Judy.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth.
Take care, Jim. Thanks for hosting this.
Well, didn't do much. Push buttons.
We'll see everyone soon.
Yeah. Okay, see you later, Allison.